Welcome everybody to today's broadcast. Today's webinar is a webinar presentation of the Resilient Power Project, a project of Clean Energy Group. This is Maria Blaise Costello, and I welcome all of you to today's event. Our topic today is Resilient Cities, Clean Energy to Power Critical Public and Private Facilities. Today's webinar is being hosted by Louis Milford, President of Clean Energy Group, and Rob Sanders, Senior Finance Director at Clean Energy Group. So as folks are logging on, I'm going to go over a quick housekeeping slide. Today, all of our participants are in listen-only mode. We will not be able to hear you. You're welcome to use the mic and speakers function of your computer. So if you have computer speakers, feel free to use that feature and not have to dial in with your phone and incur any telephone charges. You can submit questions today by typing them into the questions box that you'll see on your webinar console. Simply type in your question here and hit send, and they'll be queued up. And we will have a Q&A session following all of today's guest speaker presentations. This webinar is being recorded, and this recording and other Resilient Power webinar recordings can be found on the link on your screen here and also on a Vimeo channel. All of these presentations and recordings will be posted on the Resilient Power website, and that URL is here, www.resilient-power.org. So with that, I'd like to introduce Louis Milford, President of Clean Energy Group, to talk a little bit about the Resilient Power Project and to give an overview of today's webinar topic. Go ahead, Lou.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks for all of you for listening in. As Maria said, this is a webinar that's sponsored by Clean Energy Group, which is a national nonprofit. We work on clean energy finance and policy and technology across the country. Our focus is on state and communities, trying to expand the markets for clean energy, renewable power, to scale up those markets. We also manage an organization called Clean Energy States Alliance, which is a organization of most of the major state energy policymakers who manage system benefit charge funds. The project today we're talking about is Resilient Power, which is one that's generously funded by JPB Foundation, Surdna Foundation, and Kresge. And Maria, if you'd flip the slide, I'll just talk about that for a second. This project is an effort to expand markets for clean, resilient power systems. Our focus has been largely on solar and battery storage, but we're also looking at other technologies like CHP. We are in the business of trying to support stronger energy state policies, encourage city officials to develop resilient power programs and policies to protect vulnerable populations like the poor and the disabled and the elderly, many of which, as we saw after Sandy and other events, suffer disproportionately from power outages. We're also providing technical assistance to get projects done. We want to see deals done. We think as more projects like solar plus storage projects are done, we'll bring those costs down, and we'll see the benefits that accrue to people of need. And you'll see a number of reports that are listed there that we've done over the last 6 or 7 months. So if you could flip it, Maria. The particular focus today is on a paper that we produced about a month ago, which is about what cities can do in this area. Rob will talk about that in a bit. The main focus is to look at ways that cities can become more resilient by looking at these power systems, how to finance them, how to install them, and how to address what could be considered kind of a divide, an inequality. I think what we're going to see over the future is that technologies like solar and storage will be coming into the market very strongly. You're going to see them in high-end applications like commercial and business applications, and that's a good thing. But we need them in places to serve people and to protect people from outages and also to reduce bills. So Rob will get into this. I'm going to turn it over to him and our guest speakers of today. As Maria said, if you have questions, put them in as you're listening, and then we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. So let me turn it over to Rob.
Great. Thanks a lot, Lou.
Okay.
Well, it's great to have the 3 guest speakers we have today. Kristin Baja is the Climate and Resilience Planner with the Office of Sustainability at Baltimore City. She is responsible for development and implementation of the city's Disaster Preparedness Project and Plan, DP3 for short, which integrates climate adaptation with hazard mitigation efforts. She also leads Baltimore's climate change communication and outreach, resiliency planning, and STAR community certification. Kristin holds a Master of Urban Planning degree and a Master's of Science degree from the University of Michigan. Lori Riley directs communications for Sustainable CUNY of the University of New York. Lori is the author of many sustainability documents and grants that address the balance of systems costs for installing solar, and collaborated on the formation of the Smart Distributed Generation Hub that we're going to hear about this afternoon. Lori spent 18 years as a broadcast journalist and won 5 New York State Broadcasters Awards. So we're glad to have her. And Erica Helson is a New York State Solar Ombudsman at Sustainable CUNY, where she leads the Smart Distributed Generation Hub Resilient Solar Project. Prior to joining Sustainable CUNY, Erica provided outreach for NYSERDA's commercial and industrial energy efficiency incentive programs and project managed solar installations in California and led disaster preparedness programming for the American Red Cross Greater Los Angeles region. Erica holds a BA from Pitzer College and MPA from Columbia University. Okay, next please. I'll say a little bit about this paper and about give some context for today's guest speakers. Our focus on city strategies to increase resilient power began with the Baltimore project we did with support from the Able Foundation. We were asked by the Able Foundation to look at how solar PV could be expanded in Baltimore in ways that benefit low-income communities. In our report, Clean Energy for Resilient Communities, we found that a key strategy should be to deploy solar plus battery storage to ensure that the critical services and facilities benefiting low-income communities continue to operate during extended grid outages caused by extreme weather events. The report also recommended that critical facilities identified in Baltimore's DP3 report should be evaluated for their suitability for resilient solar power with battery storage. And we're going to hear again more about that DP3 report later in this webinar. We also recommended that the City of Baltimore and its development agencies should take advantage of existing bond financing and credit enhancement mechanisms, as well as third-party ownership and financing structures to develop solar on public buildings and nonprofit-owned facilities using battery storage. Next slide, please. So what are cities doing to be more energy resilient? As part of their disaster preparedness planning, many cities have already made large strides in evaluating in what ways their multiple infrastructures are vulnerable. But few cities have focused on risks and mitigation strategies associated with extended power outages. And none has yet identified and committed the resources needed to develop a citywide implementation strategy to protect critical facilities and vulnerable populations with cleaner, more resilient technologies like solar plus storage. New businesses are emerging that can provide leasing, power purchase agreements, and other financing options to bring these technologies to broader markets, including low-income communities. And some cities are beginning to see how FERC rules have provided solar plus storage systems with revenue streams that greatly reduce payback periods for these systems, cutting in half those payback periods. Next slide, please. And what we are seeing are strong local initiatives that have created important elements from which to build citywide resilient power plans. In New York City, for instance, there's the Smart DG Hub, which City University of New York through Sustainable CUNY has been awarded a major DOE grant to address local barriers to developing resilient power projects. Again, we'll hear more about that today. In Chicago, New York City, Washington, D.C., and Boston, we're starting to see strong interest from developers and owners of affordable housing, elderly and assisted living facilities in developing solar and storage projects. We also see interest from city officials in bringing solar and energy storage systems to police and fire facilities, schools, community emergency centers. And a number of states have found ways to leverage their funding for local resilient power projects. Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources had created a $40 million municipal grant program to award state funds to cities for 31 community resilient power projects. These grants funded both technical assistance and project implementation for a range of city facilities. Again, emergency shelters, police and fire stations, hospitals, municipal fueling stations. In New Jersey, the Energy Resilience Bank was created in July of 2014 with an initial capitalization of $200 million. Clean water and wastewater treatment facilities have been an initial priority, but public housing, hospitals, and schools will also be funded. And again, in New Jersey, their Bureau of Public Utilities recently awarded grants for 13 projects totaling $3 million. Most of them solar and storage projects for schools, utility authorities, and government buildings. They plan to increase the amount of grant funding to $6 million in round 2 of the program. Next slide, please. So our recent paper, What Cities Should Do, has made a number of high-level recommendations for cities that are thinking about developing a resilient power implementation strategy. These include make sure it's someone's job to accomplish this work and ensure close coordination between city departments, identify the critical facilities in the city in need of protection, identify the critical power loads for priority projects, conduct engineering assessments for those priority projects, develop a viable financial plan including third-party ownership options, and develop and supervise an implementation and oversight plan for the installation of technologies, including evaluation of project performance. Okay, well, we have some great speakers again today who will talk about how they're working to increase energy resilience in Baltimore and New York City. So now I'd like to turn it over to Kristin Baja to talk about Baltimore.
Just one moment, Kristin. I'm going to pull up your slides here.
All right.
All right, you should be good to go.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the hazards that we're facing here in Baltimore and kind of why we decided to develop our plan, a little bit about the plan background, and then what we've been doing thus far with implementation and how that connects with a lot of the work that Rob and Lou have done and building that sort of resilient power implementation strategy. So just to kind of give some background on hazards and what we've been seeing here, many of you might have seen us in the news recently this past year with the retaining wall collapse, and this is just a picture from that event. So I'm going to just quickly review some of the things that we're seeing, with sea level rise, heavy precipitation changes, a lot more or larger coastal storms. We're seeing increased heat and heat waves, as well as some pretty heavy flooding events and storms. So that's something that we took into account, and kind of a quick review of our hazards is just most of the things that we're seeing are going to be more severe, more extensive, or increase in intensity. And that was one of the reasons we thought, wow, we really need to start figuring out what we're going to do and have a comprehensive plan. So that made us kind of get into this planning process, which was to take a unique approach and look at the current all-hazard mitigation planning process. And instead of just looking at historical hazards, we wanted to actually integrate a climate adaptation plan and also do some predictive modeling for what we were anticipating seeing in the future. And that would guide the overall resiliency of the city. So in that, we had an advisory committee, a very large advisory committee. They're not all identified on this slide, but just to give you a quick idea of the number of other departments that were involved, as well as external groups, both regional and local, that were part of the process of this plan development. And we had a 40-person advisory committee and then multiple subcommittees that were engaged as well. And part of our process was really to go through what you would do in both a all-hazard mitigation planning process as well as in climate adaptation planning process, where we identified the hazards, reviewed our historical impacts, conducted our vulnerability assessment, did a lot with our impacts assessment as far as modeling and integrating projected climate conditions, and then created a plan that had our vision, 6 goals, 50 strategies, and 231 actions moving forward. And just to give you a quick idea, we changed up the structure a bit. So instead of sticking with a typical all-hazard mitigation plan where things are sectioned out by hazard, we changed it up to more align with the way that we implement things here in the City of Baltimore. So we created these 4 main categories of infrastructure, buildings, natural systems, and public services. And within each of those, identified a lot of subcategories where we had certain experts on hand who could help identify what we needed to do moving forward to become a more resilient city. So from there, we created the Disaster Preparedness Plan that was adopted unanimously in October of 2013. And this just gives a quick picture of the cover of the plan with those subcategories of the headers and then some of the strategies and actions listed below. It also had implementation guidelines integrated, so we had our lead agencies, our stakeholders, and timeframes identified. Which was really nice. Another big piece of what we did with the plan was to crosswalk it with existing planning efforts and existing plans. So we went through a huge process of looking at all of our existing plans and also plans that were in other departments projects and tried to identify ways for us to enhance those projects over time. So that was a really good way to prioritize a lot of these strategies and actions and work with our lead stakeholders. So what do we do? Well, we're moving on to implementation. Like I said, this was adopted in 2013, so we've had about a full year of implementation. We've done a lot of different things in a lot of different areas, but today I'm going to focus a lot on some of the overlaps in energy. And the way that we've kind of started with prioritization is taking our Baltimore Climate Action Plan that was adopted in 2020 and the Disaster Preparedness Project and Plan. And as you can see here,
Kristin, it's Maria. Hey, sorry to interrupt. We're having some weird audio blips that I'm hearing. I'm not sure if the audience is hearing them as well. You've faded out a little bit. So would you take things just slightly slower? Because if it does blip, then they don't miss like the bulk of your sentence. So sorry to interrupt.
I can go a bit slower. I'm a fast talker. Sorry.
Thank you so much.
So basically what we're looking at is the overlaps between mitigation that is in our climate action plan and some of the things that we're focusing on with energy savings and land use and transportation, and overlapping those with our DP3. And in that, you can kind of see some of these overlaps here. Renewable energy, energy grid, and energy efficiency obviously being very big ones for what we're talking about today. So the way that we're really approaching it is to kind of consider a whole block approach. Instead of just focusing on a couple of those overlaps, we're looking at blocks in their entirety and thinking about energy education, weatherization, but also trees and greening, stormwater, and also ideas for how we're monitoring a lot of these changes over time. In that, we've got a few residential pilot projects, and we've been using a lot of the recommendations from Lou and Rob's original document that they put out in 2014. So we've really focused on areas that are most vulnerable to the impacts of high heat and flooding, as those are our 2 biggest issues right now, and also most vulnerable to the impacts from climate change. And we've identified a pilot project neighborhood where we're looking to implement solar on 10 row houses in a low-income area. This is with a couple of our partner organizations and other groups. So we are working with Civic Works, which is a local job training group, and then also with Grid Alternatives. And they are assisting us in getting the houses selected and then speccing the solar systems for each of those houses and figuring out how to get them installed so that the cost will actually be only $250 a year for each of the residents with no extra energy bill on top of that. So as part of it, we're also making sure that Civic Works is partnering with Grid to do job training as part of the installation process. So we're combining those efforts with the energy education work we do, the weatherization work, and then, like I mentioned, some of the greening work that we're doing. In addition, we're really considering sort of these resiliency hubs. So focusing on neighborhoods where we have people who are going to be most vulnerable and typically in neighborhoods where we lose power very quickly. We are identifying community centers with members of the community and asking them where is a trusted gathering space, where is a space that they're looking to go and they're willing to go. And then we're starting to work on the weatherization process with those locations, energy efficiency work, and getting cool roofs put in place so that we can start to explore the solar and what we're going to do with battery backup. We have not been able to move forward on that yet, but we have identified the locations. And then we have a lot of work happening with a lot of our private partners in the area. So Dominos Sugar is one of those. Just in this past year, they put on 76 solar panels, which is great and definitely helping Baltimore reach a lot of our solar goals, as well as our Inner Harbor water wheel, which is sort of has many different functions, sits at the base of one of our waterways, which collects a lot of trash for us, but also produces electricity with the solar panels on the back of that water wheel, and it's a really nice thing at the Inner Harbor for people to see as well. We've also been doing a lot of focus on critical facilities. So like Rob mentioned earlier, one of the recommendations was to really consider critical facilities. So we have just put in 4,200 panels on 5 acres at the Back River wastewater treatment plant, and we're actually looking at putting in more of those in the near future. And that's working with our energy office to work with Constellation Energy to site over 10 megawatts of solar in the next few years. So that's been a big focus for us moving forward. And then I was asked to kind of talk about some of the lessons that we learned. I think for us it's really leveraging other projects and programs. So the Baltimore Energy Initiative is a citywide program that works with a lot of different agencies to streamline our energy conservation programs and education efforts. And that's something that we've really built on and been working with to try to make sure that all of these efforts are coming together. People are considering resiliency, critical facilities, and all the different parts as part of this process and program. Also, we've had the Baltimore Energy Challenge in place for quite a long time. I believe it's been 5 years. And that's really grassroots efforts in neighborhoods and schools where we ask people to sign a pledge committing to reduce their energy use through behavior changes. And then in return, we give them a kit of products, and we actually offer free energy audits. And we do a lot of connecting them with the weatherization services that we offer as well. And so, like, you know, we're still in the process really of taking these actions from the DP3 and implementing them. You know, a lot of the time was taken identifying the overlaps and doing the crosswalking. What we have found has worked well is starting with these small pilot projects to really iron out some of the kinks and also identify who the best partners are and how we can integrate other benefits such as the job creation. We're also focusing on any projects that have the co-benefits between mitigation and adaptation. Obviously, we're exploring funding mechanisms, and that's something that's ongoing, but has been great to have assistance on. And then, you know, focusing on projects that are going to take into account those future impacts. And that's all I have right now, and I apologize for going so fast in the beginning.
Great, thanks, Kristin. I'd like to hand it over to Lori Riley next.
Great, Lori, so give me just a second to pull up your slides. And the audience, please do take a minute to think about if you have any questions for Kristin and enter them in now. Don't wait till the end, and we'll answer as many of your questions as we can as time allows. So one moment here while I give mouse control to Erica and Lori. Great, Erica and Lori, you're all set to go.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us to participate. As you know, together we're all trying to strive to create these resilient cities and these models and develop pathways to bringing clean energy, and particularly with storage, to power our critical public and private facilities. So, for those that who may not know, CUNY stands for the City University of New York, which is actually 24 public colleges and 500,000 students, all within New York City. So not quite as large as Baltimore as a city, but pretty large organization, 300 buildings. And so CUNY is really tied in to the infrastructure of New York City. And we also provide many of the emergency shelters for the city as well. So through Sustainable CUNY, under the direction of Tria Case, we lead sustainability efforts on our campuses. But in addition to that, we also lead the implementation of multiple federal, state, and city solar programs, and really have developed this collaborative platform for integrating solar energy into New York City and the entirety of New York State. And you may think, well, why CUNY, why a university? And I think that the interesting approach here is that we are this objective, trusted third party that can bridge administrations. There's changeovers in administration all the time on every level. We're still here. So we've been doing this since 2005. So we can bring projects to fruition this way and keep our platform going. So our work in solar has now naturally led us to the development of the Smart DG Hub, the Smart Distributed Generation Hub, with the idea of creating the strategic pathway for bringing storage, batteries into the New York City, resiliency measures into the New York City solar market on a broad scale. So these have been our focus areas, as I mentioned, since 2005, 2006, as we're implementing this infrastructure and these grants. So we've developed permitting and model zoning and grid analysis and so forth. We developed the New York City solar map. We actually mapped every single one of the 1 million building tops in New York City for the potential of solar. There's a calculator there, so you can see how much solar you can generate, what it can offset for your energy, the payback time, and it's really a cool tool. It's something that it's a great educational tool. It's a great planning tool. It gives us data and analytics, and now we're building it for the entire state of New York. So this has been one of those technology tools that are really helping. We're not doing this alone. We have a lot of partners in this, so a lot of leveraging of leaders in this area that can get things done, decision makers at the right level. So all of this has led us to creating the Smart DG Hub. So just to give you an idea of how well this is done for us since we began, you can see the growth of solar there. There's an article in Huffington Post today that New York City is number 9 as far as top cities around solar. And this is also, besides the generating of the megawatts of solar, it's about the economic value as well. As you can see there, over 269 million. There's a lot of rooftops. I think we're over 2,700 rooftops in New York City that now have solar. And my understanding is that we have almost this much in the queue right now. And our partners are all the ones whose hands touch solar. So from the Department of Buildings to the Fire Department to the Mayor's Office and Economic Development, our white papers inform the incentives, inform the policy makers, because we also know, we've learned, you can't just throw a new technology that develops energy into the market. You will have the Department of Buildings saying, what are all the ramifications of this? Is this safe? How do I inspect it? How do we permit this? The fire department will say, how do we deal with this if it's on top of a building that is on fire? So these are all of our partners at the table, so we can remove the barriers as we go. So as such, we have developed this platform that has worked very well. Then we were hit by Hurricane Sandy, and it was the third storm in 2 years that really had a major power failure effect in New York City. And when you have that in New York City, when you have that, that lower area of Manhattan there is where Wall Street is. And when Wall Street gets flooded or gets out of power, that affects everybody. So here's a quick idea. $50 billion in cost overall for that one outage there. There was 5 million people out of power. And the cost in New York City, about $19 billion alone. So that gives you an idea. Now, CUNY provides shelters. We're one of the city's major shelter providers, including those for special medical needs. So here we are at this unique position of being intricately tied to integrating solar into New York City and New York State, plus we provide emergency shelters. We provide education across the state around solar for municipal leaders and workshops. We convene the installers. So we started getting calls right after Hurricane Sandy from, literally I got calls from around the world, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. They wanted to know, how did those solar installations, at that time there was about 672 solar arrays on New York City rooftops. How did they do during a hurricane. They did just fine, thank you. If there was inverters in the basement and there was a surge from the ocean that came in, like anything else in the basement, that got corroded with the salt water. But the solar installations, there was no problem with them, except for the fact, of course, solar installations are designed to shut down when the grid goes down so that you're not feeding power back on to the grid while there's linemen working on it. So all of that solar, and you can see here, we did an estimate there of what could have been generated during the storm. This could have made huge differences to people. Some people say that even if they just had the ability to charge their cell phone, they would have stayed in their home. One of our shelters, we had no power there, so we could not help people at that. So this was all this solar energy going to waste. It was shed, so to speak. So that led us to really think about it. And now, as you look at the growth of solar in those areas, just since 2012, in 3 years, you can see how much the growth of solar is. But even that, only some of them have what they call an inverter that is able to supply emergency power. Because as we know now, you can't take a new technology or batteries or storage and just throw it into the marketplace. There needs to be a pathway for developing this market for solar plus storage, for resiliency measures, or for solar plus daytime emergency power. So shortly after Hurricane Sandy, we formed the Smart Distributed Generation Hub, DG Hub, not just about solar because there's lots of other distributed generation out there. And we made phone calls. And they came. They all came. The Department of Defense and MIT and Homeland Security and FEMA. And we sat around a room and we had whiteboards up everywhere. And we say, you know, what are the barriers? What do we need to do to make better use of the clean energy that we do have, and to also make policy planners and installers and the public aware of the many values of clean energy, the many values of solar beyond what's on the rooftop generating when the sun is out. So we identified these 4 areas. It was a great day. You should have seen everybody up there with big whiteboards and a lot of really smart people thinking, what are the key areas? And we came up with these 4 key areas of hardware technologies, policy and legal, software technologies, and economics and finance. So these were our 4 areas that became our 4 working groups. So these are the areas that we knew that we needed to really think through if we're going to integrate batteries and storage and resiliency measures not only into emergency power and emergency planning, but into other areas of concern when the grid is constrained on very hot days. What is everything that we need to be addressed? Do we have the right people at the table that are decision makers within their own agencies that can help us make these changes? So we gathered everybody together, and this is a platform that we used called project-based change management. And we don't make the plan and then ask everybody else to implement it. Everybody who has a hand in implementing it is part of making that plan, that feels that they really have a voice in it, and of course they really know what needs to be done to make the change. So I'm now going to turn it over to Erica, because we did indeed just recently, as was mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, receive funding from the Department of Energy for what is called the Resilient Solar Project. And I'll now turn it over to Erica.
All right, thanks, Lori. So Lori provided some context about how the Smart DG Hub formed, and now I want to explain what we're doing with the Resilient Solar Project, which is the project funded by the Department of Energy out of the DG Hub. And I'm going to talk about this in the context of other municipalities or community groups that might want to consider doing a similar project to encourage more resilient solar in their community. So the way we've structured this project is there's a project team which is led by Sustainable CUNY in partnership with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and Meister Consultants Group. And this project team oversees an advisory board and 4 working groups. And you may notice that those 4 working groups are focused on the areas that were identified during the original DG Hub meeting. Okay, so Lori mentioned that we're using project-based change management for the Resilient Solar Project, and that's an effective approach, but only if you have the right people in the room. So here I'm showing on this slide who our key partners are for the DG Hub project. And when we were forming these working groups, we wanted to consider all the players who are involved in the solar plus storage space. And the result is that we have really diverse representation across these 4 working groups, from battery and software providers to the New York City Emergency Management and the Mayor's Office. So from the industry, we have good representation from battery providers, as I mentioned, solar installers. So we're learning from these groups in the industry the challenges that they're facing. And then when we look at how these projects, solar plus storage, is financed, on this working group as well, we have very diverse representation from Rob from the Clean Energy Group, who is very familiar with the different options available for financing solar plus storage, from municipal bonds to third-party financing. The New York City Economic Development Corporation, so they're interested in this for the resiliency benefits that it brings to the city, but also things like workforce development. So as this industry grows, that's great for New York City, as well as the finance companies who are actually funding storage projects. And then looking at our policy and legal working group, we know that if we want to lower the soft costs associated with resilient PV, we need to look at the permitting process with the Department of Buildings, what the fire department's requirements are, and also the interconnection with the utility companies. So if we can streamline the processes with those agencies, then we can lower the costs of resilient PV in New York City. So that's why we've engaged the Department of Buildings, FDNY, and the Mayor's Office, and we're very pleased to have top-level buy-in from these agencies. So now I want to talk about what we're actually going to do with this Resilient Solar Project, which is a 3-year initiative. So in the first year, we're focusing on collecting information. So we'll survey the industry, those who are working on resilient PV systems in New York City, and asking them what are the challenges that they're facing, but also what are the potential solutions and what would they recommend be changed in order to lower costs, which are in New York City. And each year will build on the next. So in the second year, we're taking all that information that we've collected from surveying the industry and doing research in our working groups, and we're creating several educational resources. So we'll create some fact sheets. So for example, what are the standard hardware and software requirements involved in a resilient PV deployment? What are model guidelines for code? So if the industry is having trouble permitting these systems, well, what codes are relevant to that process, and what are the recommendations for overcoming those challenges? And really central to this entire project is the roadmap that will be released in year 2. So as Lori mentioned, if we want to see more resiliency in New York City in terms of our energy infrastructure, we really need a path for how that will be accomplished. So the roadmap will be compiled. The roadmap will compile all the recommendations from our 4 working groups, and those recommendations will be our path to creating more resiliency in our energy infrastructure. And then in year 3, again, as I said, each year will build on the previous, so we want to make sure that these resources we've developed in year 2 are reaching the people who need it. We don't want to create these resources in a vacuum. So the 3rd year will be really focused on outreach and sharing our findings and lessons learned. So we'll be doing case studies, looking at what projects are being developed in New York City, and making sure that those project developers have our roadmap recommendations so that they can implement these changes and bring down their soft costs. We'll also be doing workshops with code officials and solar installers. So that's sort of our big picture 3-year plan with this Resilient Solar Project. And what I want to talk about now is for other communities that might be considering doing a similar project, what are some of the considerations they should keep in mind? So first is ensuring key stakeholders are represented. So we talked about this earlier with the formation of our working groups and project-based change management. It's important that everyone who's involved in this energy storage paired with solar space is there at the table. So for example, we've heard from some energy storage project developers that sometimes their customers' peak demand does not align with the utilities' peak demand, but the energy storage incentives are designed to meet the system-wide peak demand. So that means that buildings that have a peak demand that maybe falls in the evening outside of the system's peak demand are not incentivized to develop a resilient PV project. So by bringing together the utilities and the industry together, we can work through those types of issues. So number two, balancing the economic incentives for storage with resiliency needs. And what I mean here is that, these energy storage projects, they're very attractive because of all of the economic benefits that they bring. So whether you're in the PJM territory looking at the revenue streams from ancillary services, or here in New York City where the economic benefits come more from reducing your peak demand charges, either way these storage projects are offering a lot of economic value. But again, our focus, and I think the focus for the Clean Energy Group as well, is on resiliency. So while an energy storage project without solar might bring a lot of value to the building, is it really as valuable when you think about it in terms of resiliency? And can we encourage those buildings to add solar to their projects so that when we do face another widespread grid outage, the life of those batteries? Third, responding to REV, or reforming the energy vision. So I imagine many of you who are listening are familiar with the REV initiative coming out of the Public Service Commission in New York. It's expected that these proceedings will have a big impact on solar and energy storage in a really positive way, so we think this will be a good thing. But as those changes are coming down from the Public Service Commission, it's important that our group stay informed of the changes and how this will affect our projects. So for other communities, whatever policy initiatives are going on in your state, it'll be important that you consider those. And then fourth, sharing project findings with targeted audiences. So I mentioned in year 3 we're doing a lot of outreach. With all these efforts, you've taken the time to engage the key stakeholders. You're learning about what the challenges are and coming up with creative solutions, but it's important that those solutions and those recommendations are reaching the appropriate audience. So I want to summarize here in talking about what the DG Hub goals are and what success looks like for us. So again, the objective of this project is to create a greater resilient distributed energy system in New York City. And we want this to be used as a model that can be expanded to the rest of the state and to other communities across the country. And we will do this by first developing a platform. So that's really what we see the DG Hub is. It's a platform that is bringing focus to solar plus storage in New York City. And through that platform, through our working groups and advisory board, we're engaging the key stakeholders involved in the energy storage coupled with solar space. And those stakeholders are sharing their challenges and their solutions with us and helping us communicate them to the appropriate people, whether that's the Department of Buildings, the Fire Department, or the Mayor's Office. And by addressing those challenges and coming up with solutions, we think that we'll see more solar and storage in New York City and across the state by streamlining those processes, lowering the soft costs as we've seen our work done with traditional PV. And the end result is that we'll see next time we have a Hurricane Sandy or another widespread grid outage, we'll see that the critical facilities that are supporting our communities in this time of need remain powered, again, when we need it most. So that sums it up for me. If you have any questions, my contact information is available, and I'll hand it back to, I guess, Rob for questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Erica. Actually, I'd like to hand it back to Lou for questions.
Okay, thanks, folks. We have a bunch of good questions. Let me try to group a few of them, maybe in a couple sets, starting with Kristin. So maybe if you could get yourself back on.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, great. Let me group a couple of these questions together. One is has to do with the neighborhood, the $250 a year project for the houses. A question was whether maintenance is included in that figure, and then the sort of related question to that, I guess, ways to help with these systems for low-income renters. So those are two related questions, and I've got a couple more after that.
Yeah, so I believe the maintenance is included for up to 10 years with those, and we are working on so this is being done specifically through Grid Alternatives, and they're actually the ones who are looking at the funding for the low income on the row houses. We are still working on sort of a long-term scheme with them. This is just for the first pilot project, and we haven't really identified the model that they have right now out in California, that we don't necessarily know how that model will work here yet. So we're still in the process of exploring that with them, and that's kind of what this pilot project is doing, is offering us that opportunity. So I don't have a great answer for you there.
Okay,
everything for us is right in the beginning stages.
Sure, no problem. Thank you. A couple questions on the wastewater treatment project, Kristin. Does the solar provide resilient power to the treatment plant? I think that was the question. And if so, or not, I guess, how much backup power, if you know, was considered for the system that was installed for the wastewater treatment plant?
I don't actually know how much backup time was considered with that system. I do know that they're using it partially for the treatment plant, okay. But that it's mostly the city is working with Constellation to try to site these 10 megawatts of solar, and the wastewater treatment plant had a lot of available land for us to use. So that was what allowed us to do that first sort of pilot project there, and we will probably be expanding upon that.
Okay, great. A question did come up with respect to that, but I'll save it for later, which goes to, what size storage is considered optimal. But let me save that a bit for Rob. After the questions for both Lori or Erica, there are quite a few around New York. So let me shoot a few your way, folks. I guess one question, I think I know the answer, but let me ask you this. In your finance group, one question was, have you yet identified any best practices to monetize the value streams from solar and storage? And I think Rob may have something to add maybe at the end after you try to answer that as well.
Well, I'll just start and let Erica add some more detail, but we actually are kicking off the working groups this next week. So we are just starting the project. We've just finished our contracting and our funding and so forth for this project. But we are working with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and we want to really look at the many values of storage and how to monetize that. So I'm talking about peak shifting and load shifting and things like that that make a difference in an urban area. Especially, where you might have a smaller rooftop but a large load in many-storied buildings. So it's certainly on our list. And Erica, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. I'll just add that, as Lori said, the working groups will begin meeting this month. So formally as a working group, we haven't identified all the various value streams. But the core project of that working group is a calculator that will be integrated into the New York solar map that Lori mentioned during her initial slides. So by the end of this project, someone will be able to go onto the map, look up their address, see their solar potential, and then we're building in some resiliency components to that calculator so that they'll be able to look at what an estimate of a cost and payback for a solar plus storage system.
And I'll just add quickly that what we knew from when we started with these solar projects in New York City in 2005, there was less than a megawatt, and there wasn't very many people financing solar. But as we grew and we were able to provide the financial institutions with the data of the value and the information on that technology, the finance companies came into the market. So I think as we go through this project, the data that we can provide is what finance companies want to see.
While we're on that point on the value streams, maybe Rob, while we're talking about this, could you just jump in a bit, and for people who aren't familiar with, what the new type of value streams through FERC rules and others, could be tapped for these systems, just to provide just a real short snapshot of what's new about this when it comes to financing them through these value streams?
Well, in addition to the investment tax credits and solar RECs and peak shaving opportunities and demand response, which are all fairly traditional value streams for solar. You also have the ability in areas where the FERC rules, especially FERC Rule 755, is in effect, which is all through PJM, through New Jersey, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Ohio, up to Chicago. You have the ability to pick up revenue for what's called frequency regulation, which is charging and discharging quickly and accurately upon signals from the grid operator to keep the grid in balance every moment, which is required for an efficient, stable grid. So, and those fees are dramatic. For instance, some of the projects we're seeing in New Jersey right now, over half of the revenue of the economic case for solar storage, the cost of it is picked up through frequency regulation services. So it can be considerable, and it can reduce the paybacks to 4 years or so for significant projects where PJM is in operation. One solar storage developer has said that 97% of the cost of a system can be monetized now, meaning of a resilient power system can be monetized in PJM right now. So there are ways to do this with third-party ownership and financing in conjunction with these revenue streams.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, for those who want to know more about that, we've written a bit about it, and we just did a webinar yesterday in which one company, AJ Mensa, that's done some of the New Jersey projects, actually has laid out the chart showing some of the value streams and the revenue streams that Rob mentions. It's very dramatic, and I think that's one of the as yet unrecognized reasons why these systems are going to expand exponentially and provide not only resiliency but potentially cost reductions through utility bills, but also as revenue generators. It's really quite an interesting combination. We've got some other questions also too, and this could go probably to Erica and others and Rob as well. These are general questions about batteries. How much power protection could they provide? How do you size them? So anyone want to jump in? I know there's a lot of complications around trying to answer that, but anyone want to jump in on how to think about that?
Sure, I'll jump in. So I think again, I was talking about the economic value of storage versus the resiliency value. So sizing your batteries depends on your goal there. So if you're looking at resiliency, it's important to look at the critical loads of the facility and size the battery to those critical loads. Whereas if you're looking at if the driver for your project is the economic value and resiliency is sort of secondary to that, then the battery should be sized to either, it depends on where you are. If you're in PJM territory, what the needs are for frequency regulation, what size batteries you need there. But in New York City, where you can't take advantage of value streams from frequency regulation, you need to look at the peak demand of your facility, and how much you need to reduce that peak demand is how you would size your batteries. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would also just say, besides the amount of critical load, the question is how much duration you want to continue to provide power in an outage. And besides the economic factor of it, I think we forget that there's certain applications where there's a large non-economic value in providing on-site resilient power, whether that's helping elderly folks shelter in place or whatever. It's important to keep in mind that there are large costs associated with disrupting people's lives.
Exactly. I think one of the things that we're going to be trying to do in the next couple months is to lay out some of the options to try to address the question that came from the questioner about comparing time of need, duration, cost, and lay that out. It's an early market, but we need to try to give out some of the options there. There are a couple other questions as well. We're kind of running up against 3 o'clock. Are folks considering combined heat and power, in combination with solar and storage applications? So anyone want to jump in on that?
Well, that's why we named it the Distributed Generation Hub and not the Solar Hub, for that very reason. And the utilities are all at the table with us, and that was a particular topic at that first meeting too, was how to best utilize combined heat and power with storage as well during emergencies, because there were some facilities that were able to stay open that had that type of technology in New York City during Sandy. So right now, the pathway we're looking at is with solar, but that doesn't mean that we're not creating that pathway for other distributed generation to follow.
Thanks. And we're actually funding some folks to look at projects in New York City that combine very small combined heat and power with solar and storage. As an organization, a company called Bright Power, that's looking at that. So if anyone wants to know more about that, contact us as well, and we'll try to help you out.
Kristin, we are actually looking at combined heat and power with solar at Back River, which will be implemented in the next 1 to 2 years, and at our Ashburton drinking water treatment plant. So we are looking at those sort of combined efforts and bringing them together.
Great. I've got one other question. This has to do with vendors. Maybe, Rob, this might be a question for you. Other than Solar City, what other vendors are offering solar plus storage services?
Well, there's one of the ones that we've worked with in the past has been Solar Grid Storage, which was recently acquired by SunEdison, which is, I think, a good thing, a very good thing. They certainly have a stronger balance sheet and access to a lot of capital, not at venture capital costs, and so. There are quite a few vendors involved in this. It depends on what the application is and what size of equipment system that's being considered here. But again, we'd be glad to discuss some of those options.
Yeah, we put together kind of an informal vendor list, so if someone wants to know more about that, we do plan to post this. I don't think it's been posted yet, but we plan to do that. So Maria, I see we're up against 3 o'clock, and I think we're pretty much have covered the bulk of the questions, I think, so we may have done our job.
Great. I just want to let everyone know of another event that we have coming up on the topic of resilience. The Department of Energy is offering a solicitation, and we're going to go over the components of that solicitation on a webinar on April 7th, so if anyone would like to tune into that, there's the URL on the screen to register for that. Also, we have a Resilient Power monthly newsletter and other notices of webinars. You can sign up to get future event notices by the bit.ly shown up here. And then, as a last resort, you can always go to our website at resilient-power.org, and you'll be able to find everything you need to know about Resilient Power that we're doing on that web page. Rob, do you want to give guest speakers one last chance to mention anything that they might have missed in their presentations or any last words?
Well, certainly. You heard the lady. Anything else to add? I certainly thank...
Go ahead,
I'm
Erica
sorry.
and Lori.
I just saying thank you for the opportunity, and we look forward to collaborating and sharing our work.
We feel the same. Thank you very much to all our speakers today.
Great. Any other last words? Well, hearing none, thanks again to all of our participants for tuning in. We hope that you'll join us for another broadcast in the future. Thanks again to our guest speakers. This has been a very informative webinar. It is recorded, and it will be up on the Resilient Power website by the end of the day today. So thank you very much to everyone. We're going to close this out now, and I wish